This backyard produces food, fertilizer, and even water almost endlessly. At first glance, it doesn't look like anything special. There are no advanced machines, no complex irrigation systems, no chemical inputs stored anywhere. Just a simple space, a few living elements, and a quiet system that keeps working in the background. But what makes it truly fascinating isn't what you see, it's what you don't notice at first. Because behind this simplicity, there's a structure, a pattern, a system that has existed for thousands of years. A system that once supported entire communities long before modern agriculture ever existed. And somehow, that system disappeared from everyday life. Not because it stopped working, not because it became outdated, but because it was slowly replaced by something that looked more efficient, more scalable, more modern. And over time, people stopped noticing what was lost. They stopped asking how food was grown. They stopped questioning where it came from. And most importantly, they stopped understanding the system behind it. But if you go back far enough, to a time when survival depended entirely on nature, you'll find something very different. You'll find a world where people didn't try to dominate their environment. They adapted to it. They observed it. They learned from it. And through that process, they discovered something powerful. That nature doesn't operate in isolation. Everything is connected. Every plant, every animal, every element plays a role. And when those roles are aligned correctly, something remarkable happens. The system begins to sustain itself, not through control, but through balance, not through force, but through cooperation. And once you understand that idea, everything starts to look different. Because what we call waste often isn't waste at all. And what we think of as a complicated system is often just a series of simple connections working together. The real question is, what happens when you rebuild that system in your own space? But to really understand how powerful this idea is, you have to look at how people used to grow food when they had no other option. There was a time when farming wasn't supported by industries, machines, or chemicals. It depended entirely on observation, patience, and an understanding of how nature behaves. Farmers didn't try to control everything around them. Instead, they watched. They noticed how certain plants grew better together. They saw how animals interacted with the land. They paid attention to water, soil, and seasons, and slowly, over generations, they began to connect the dots. They realized that nature already had systems in place, systems that didn't require constant input, systems that balanced themselves if left undisturbed. In parts of Asia, this understanding led to something remarkable. Farmers began growing crops in water-filled fields. At first, it was simply a method of cultivation. But then something unexpected happened. Fish began to appear in these fields. Instead of damaging the crops, they improved the environment. They fed on insects and larvae that would normally destroy plants. Their movement helped oxygenate the water and soil, and their waste added nutrients back into the system. Then came another discovery. When ducks were introduced into these same fields, the system became even more efficient. Ducks fed on pests. They disrupted weeds. They added more nutrients through their natural processes. And suddenly, what started as a simple farming method became a complete ecosystem. Each part supported the other. Each element had a role. Nothing was wasted. The plants fed from the soil. The fish improved the water. The ducks protected the crops. And together, they created a loop. A system that didn't need chemicals. A system that didn't need external fertilizers. A system that worked with nature instead of against it. And for centuries, it worked. Quietly. Consistently. Feeding communities without exhausting the land. But then, over time, something changed. As populations grew and demand increased, farming began to shift. It became larger, more centralized, more dependent on external systems. Instead of working with natural cycles, the focus moved toward controlling outcomes. Chemical fertilizers were introduced to increase yield. Pesticides were used to eliminate pests quickly. Machines replaced manual processes to improve efficiency. And at first it seemed like a breakthrough. Food production increased, availability improved. Systems became faster and more scalable, but there was a hidden cost, because as these methods expanded, something else started to disappear: the connection between people and their food. Food stopped being something you grew and became something you bought. It moved further away from your control and deeper into systems you couldn't see. Today, most of the food you eat has traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles before reaching you. It's processed, stored, transported, and handled multiple times. And by the time it arrives, it's no longer what it originally was. But the biggest issue isn't just quality, it's dependency. Because now, your access to food depends entirely on systems that exist far beyond your reach. If supply chains slow down, prices rise. If something disrupts the system, availability drops. And in those moments, the weakness of that dependency becomes clear. That's why the idea of a self-sustaining system is becoming relevant again. Not because it replaces everything, but because it gives something back. Control, stability, resilience. And it starts with something surprisingly simple: a loop. Not a complex structure, not a large-scale setup, just a continuous cycle, where every part supports another. Imagine this: instead of throwing away your kitchen scraps, you keep them. Vegetable peels, leftover food, organic waste. Things that are usually seen as garbage suddenly become useful. You combine them with natural materials like dry leaves and organic matter, and over time, they begin to break down. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. What you're left with is something rich, something alive. Soil, not just dirt, but soil filled with nutrients, microorganisms, and life. This becomes the foundation of your system, because now you use this soil to grow food. Simple plants at first, vegetables, herbs, things that don't require much space. And as they grow, they begin to absorb everything the soil provides. They turn those nutrients into food. And when you harvest them, the parts you don't use don't go to waste. They go back into the system. And then, you introduce another element: chickens. Most people see chickens as a source of eggs, but in this system, they serve a much bigger purpose. Because what they produce isn't waste, it's fuel. Their manure is rich in nutrients. When added to compost, it accelerates the entire process. It feeds the soil, strengthens the plants, keeps the cycle moving. And this is where everything connects. The scraps from your kitchen feed the compost. The compost feeds the soil. The soil grows your food. The leftover plant material feeds the chickens. And the chickens feed the system again. Nothing is wasted. Everything flows. Everything has a purpose. And once this loop starts working, it begins to sustain itself. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually. Over time, the soil becomes richer. The plants grow stronger. The system becomes more efficient. And what started as something small becomes something powerful. Not because it grows in size, but because it grows in function. Because now, instead of depending completely on external systems, you have something of your own, something that produces, something that supports you, something that continues even when everything else slows down. And perhaps the most surprising part is how accessible it is. You don't need a large farm, you don't need expensive tools, you don't need perfect conditions, you just need to start. Even a small setup is enough. A few plants, a basic compost system, maybe a couple of chickens, and once you see how it works, everything begins to change. You stop seeing waste and start seeing resources. You stop depending blindly and start understanding systems. And you begin to realize something important. The most efficient solutions are often the simplest ones. And maybe that's the most important part of all. Not the chickens, not the compost, not even the food itself, but the understanding that comes with it. Because once you begin building a system like this, even on a very small scale, something changes in the way you see the world around you. You stop looking at waste the same way. You stop seeing dead leaves, food scraps, or organic material as useless things that need to be thrown away. Instead, you begin seeing cycles, connections, potential. And slowly, you start noticing how disconnected modern life has become from the systems that actually support it. Food appears in stores fully packaged. Water arrives instantly from pipes. Waste disappears into bins and drains without people ever thinking about where it goes next. Everything feels separated. But nature has never worked that way. Nature connects everything. Every fallen leaf becomes soil. Every broken branch feeds organisms. Every living thing eventually returns nutrients back into the system again. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is isolated. Everything flows in cycles. And perhaps that's why systems like this feel so different once you experience them. Because they reconnect you to those cycles again. You begin understanding that sustainability isn't really about technology. It isn't about expensive solutions or complicated systems. It's about relationships. The relationship between soil and water, between plants and nutrients, between animals and ecosystems, and most importantly, the relationship between people and the resources they depend on every single day. That relationship has become increasingly distant in modern life. Most people consume constantly without ever participating in the process that creates what they consume. And over time, that distance creates dependency. But when you grow even a small amount of your own food, when you build even a small self-sustaining system, something powerful happens. You regain awareness, you regain patience, and in some ways, you regain control, not total independence, not complete self-sufficiency, but resilience, the ability to support yourself, even in small ways, through systems you understand directly. And maybe that's what made ancient systems so valuable, not just their efficiency, but their stability. They were designed to continue functioning over long periods of time without exhausting the environment around them. And today, in a world increasingly dependent on fragile global systems, that lesson feels more important than ever. Because resilience doesn't come from consuming more. It comes from understanding more, understanding how systems work, understanding how nature balances itself, understanding how small actions repeated consistently over time can create something surprisingly powerful. And that's why this idea still matters after thousands of years, because even now, it works, not perfectly, not instantly, but reliably, quietly, one cycle at a time, one season at a time, one small system growing stronger over time. And maybe the future of sustainable living isn't about inventing something entirely new. Maybe it's about remembering what already worked and learning how to build it again, right here in the spaces we already have, one small step at a time.